Well, good evening. My name is Brett Tingley, and I'm the president of Parents for Reading Justice and OH Kid. On behalf of our sponsors, OH Kid, and the International Dyslexia Association's Central and Northern Ohio branches, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for being here tonight. I'd first like to introduce Sarah Hallerman, OH Kid Vice President and IDA Central Ohio Board Member. Sarah will serve as our moderator this evening. Sarah, will you please provide logistics of the presentation and let people know what to expect?
Thank you, Brett. I'm so happy to be here tonight. I'm a parent of a 10th grade student who has dyslexia. I am also, as Brett mentioned, actively partnering with Brett with OH Kid, and I serve on the board of IDA of Central Ohio. So this work is really important to me, and we are just thrilled with the number of people who have registered and who are on this call. It's super exciting. Obviously, this is a hot topic. It's an important topic. Kerry just has a wealth of information, so much knowledge on this topic. So it's going to be a treat to hear from her tonight. So as Brett said, I will be helping to moderate. And what that means is that as you are posing questions, I am going to be documenting and sort of organizing the questions possibly into categories. Kerry has a lot of information to share, great information. So we're just going to let that flow. She's going to facilitate the entire presentation, and we're going to hold questions until the end. But that doesn't mean that you can't pose a question at any time. That actually helps us because we'll have a chance to read the questions and look through them. And as I said, organize them. So at the end, I can facilitate a Q&A with Kerry. I think those are the key logistical things. I think one more thing I like to say about questions is that I know I'm a parent, and especially, in the presence of someone like Kerry, I have an urge to ask a very specific question about my child. I know I want to do that, but I'm going to hold back. I think we should all be mindful of the fact that there are many people on this call. So while we may have child-specific questions, if you can pose questions that are beneficial to everybody on the call, that'll be really helpful. So I think that's it. Brett, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Kerry Agins. Kerry is a principal in the law firm of Agins and Gilman. With a focus on special education, she has ensured that student needs are met in Ohio schools. She represents individuals in eligibility and IEP meetings, administrative reviews, and in front of state and government agencies for IDEA and Section 504 complaints, due process hearings, state-level reviews, and in federal court. Kerry has also represented parent groups in bringing successful complaints regarding systemic issues to the Ohio Department of Education. She currently serves as treasurer and board member of IDA Northern Ohio. Kerry, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, and thank you both so much for inviting me and for Brett conceiving of this program. I think that any opportunity that our three organizations have to work together, we should take advantage of. It's wonderful to have this information, to share it broadly. I think today we're expecting a pretty large number of attendees, and it seems to really cross the gamut of parents, professionals, district administrators, teachers, dyslexia practitioners, providers, certified trainers. It's wonderful as I was looking through the list to see the names of the people who want to participate today. So what I'd like to do is to pull up a PowerPoint that I'm going to use to sort of guide the discussion. I haven't necessarily made arrangements to send this, and I'm not quite sure how we would share it, but one thing I'll ask maybe the folks through Central Ohio, since I think you guys have control of the registrations, is to see if we can send this PowerPoint to the people who have registered. All right, and I got a thumbs up, so that's great news for those of you who may not see all of us on the screen. I am going to share, and a couple of the things that we really want to focus on today are not necessarily the basics. we can go through what some of those basic requirements are. But what I want to talk about today are real strategies, like in-depth ideas about how we make this function appropriately and effectively for schools and for families. You know, the intention of Connor's Odyssey and this law was to really bring quality intervention to all tiers of instruction for students that have dyslexia or dyslexic tendencies or indicia of dyslexia. So we'll see that kind of phrased a couple of different ways. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that it works and that it works for everyone, not just the students, the parents, but also the teachers that are in the trenches and really trying to figure out how to do this. Some for the first time, some have really rolled out and now been doing this for quite some time. So we have varying levels of experience, but we really want to make this work. So I'm going to go over just a few basic things and then really kind of get in depth. Some of the objectives that we have for today, again, to review the requirements with attention to practical implementation challenges. We do anticipate there being challenges. So we want to talk through what some of those may be so that schools can start thinking and planning about how to address some of those. Parents can start thinking about how they raise these concerns with their school districts if that's something that they're concerned about. And then we also want to discuss the intersection and potential alignment with how this works with special education. For many students, kind of getting to structured literacy or getting to intervention for dyslexia has been through the special education process. And with this new law, we hope to provide those interventions sooner, quicker, so that we can not obviate the need, but lessen the need for students to be referred to access this kind of instruction. The Dyslexia Guidebook includes a great number of definitions. I am not going to go over them today, but those definitions include a lot of the terms that we're going to talk about today. So if you feel like you would like to perhaps reference some of these terms or you want to reference the guidebook while we are talking, it's available on the Ohio Department of Education website. Feel free to go there and download it. Use it as a resource. Mine is printed and dog-eared and underlined and tabbed. So please, feel free to use the guidebook to access these definitions for a clear understanding of what is intended. All right, so what are we talking about? We're talking about Ohio House Bill 436. Which is a requirement that was passed 2 years ago now, that it requires Ohio public schools to screen students for dyslexia and then subsequently provide structured literacy intervention services. The Ohio Dyslexia Committee was created to develop a guidebook to identify the methods and best practices for accomplishing that, for administering screenings, for professional development, looking for pathways for teachers to become certified, and then looking at how we provide structured literacy for students that are identified as being in need of those services because they are at risk of having dyslexia. So that's sort of the foundation. And then we also have the guidebook, which I've already talked about, and a couple of things I wanted to talk about before we get into the meat of today's discussion. And the one thing I want to comment on is Ohio public records requests. So I think a lot of parents are really interested in finding out how school districts are planning to achieve these goals, what kinds of planning they've been doing, what screeners they've selected, whether or not they've put together sort of a decision tree for students to move from tier 1 to tier 2, from tier 2 to tier 3, what programs or methods school districts have developed to align to some of these structured literacy initiatives, how they plan to use those, either those planning trees or that decision making. And families are asking me, how do we get that information? Typically, the way that parents or any member of the public would try to get that information is to ask for it. And the way that you would traditionally ask for a public record is to provide a written request. Request doesn't necessarily have to be in writing, but certainly that would be best practice. You would put your request in writing. What I want to say, though, is that public records are not just any document. And there are some nuanced things to understand about public records and public records requests before you start to send a large number of requests to your school district. So this isn't a presentation about public records, but I think it is important for me to just kind of highlight a couple of things. Number one, the definition of a public record is a document that is maintained by a public entity that documents the organization or its functions, policies, decisions, procedures, operations, but it has to be a document that's actually been created for you to request a copy of it. Schools aren't necessarily required to create a written record or aggregate information that they may be keeping in separate locations in order to respond to a specific request. And sometimes I see this when parents are requesting data or numbers of students that are identified. Unless it's created in some kind of aggregate function, it's difficult sometimes for a district to respond to that kind of request. The request also has to be reasonably clear in what is being asked for, able to be located within how the records are maintained. And so you don't want to send something that's overly broad or vague, like, I want you to send me all records that you've created about the dyslexia law. That's going to be considered overbroad and vague. Instead, you're going to want to ask very specific, discrete kinds of questions. Once requested, records have to be promptly produced if they're going to be reviewed through an inspection. What that means is that you're going to come in, look at the record, and leave. If you would prefer to receive a copy, you can request that. That would have to be produced within a reasonable time frame at cost, meaning if there's a cost for copying, then that can be passed on to the person requesting. Public entities can deny a request for public records for being overly broad or for not being specific enough. So if you have requested public records and get a denial, you're going to want to go ahead and respond, request some information about why it was denied, and then you may wish to revise your request to be more specific. This, again, is kind of an entire area. I don't want to get too bogged down into that, but I want to caution people that may be anticipating requesting some of this information through a public request, that this is the kind of thing that you'll want to be cognizant of as you make those records requests. All right. Okay, so with that understanding, what I would like to do now is move on to a little bit more about the guidebook. And I have tried to divide this up into the sections that are aligned with the guidebook so you know where to find some of this information. So section 1, what is talked about in section 1 of the guidebook is best practices in literacy instruction. And this is where we really find the nuts and bolts about what it means to be a core element of the science of reading using evidence-based literacy instruction. This is a key piece of the guidebook. It is wonderfully descriptive in what is structured literacy. What are the core elements of the science of reading? What are we talking about when we're talking about making sure that we are measuring the essential early literacy skills? Basically, what we're talking about when we're doing that is we're looking at phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, fluency. I'm not sure if I named all 5 there or not, but when you're looking at all of the elements, we are really talking about making sure that our reading instruction targets each of those areas distinctly. What we have found is that we have had the development of curriculum for reading that may be better or worse in some of those areas, and that we had gotten away in some of the practices that had been adopted from the explicit and systematic kind of teacher-led instruction that students need for some of these early foundational reading skills. with this law and with the attention that the governor is placing on the science of reading, we have an opportunity to really make sure that our reading, programming, and instruction for all students, starting at Tier 1, includes these essential elements, and that they are aligned to the definition of structured literacy, science of reading, looking at all of the inherent components of instruction to make sure that we are providing a quality, comprehensive, direct, explicit, sequential, and cumulative way of teaching students how to read. And that's at the core of what we want to do here. And this first section of the guidebook really challenges districts to realign their instructional reading approach at all grade levels across this sort of MTSS framework that districts should be familiar with, that response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support framework to teach reading. And so what the guidebook does is it requires, and the guidebook of course provides the guidance, but the law requires the districts to create these MTSS teams to design a program that is responsive to these demands. So at the initial outset, these teams are going to be looking at identifying screeners, putting together professional development, and coordinating the district's response to these requirements. One thing that I think is critically important that I'm hearing is challenging for a lot of districts is that this multidisciplinary team must include trained and certified personnel and a stakeholder with expertise in the identification, intervention, and remediation of dyslexia. And I want to reiterate this because that team composition is really important. Having someone on the team who is certified in these methods really gives the team the foundation to understand how these policies tie into curriculum, tie into professional development, how it ties into data collection, progress monitoring, deciding when students move from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3, and how these programs or this method really works. And so one of those requirements that I can't sort of tell teams to look at closely enough is making sure that you have a certified person on your team that is creating this process. It is a requirement of the Ohio Revised Code. It is not a suggestion. The law says trained and certified, not or certified. And then it also includes a definition of what certified means. And so we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation about who is and who is not certified. But this is really a huge strategy consideration for schools as they're putting together their planning team, and also for parents as they're looking at the decision-making process that districts have put together. Another strategy consideration that I really want everyone to focus on when we're talking about the implementation of this law is, does the intervention that is being contemplated as a part of this law align to the core elements of science of reading, evidence-based literacy instruction? And when I say that, I'm also going to ask you, how do you know the answer to that question? What is the framework that you have used? What is the alignment process? What is your selection and evaluation process for that curriculum? And how have you decided that it meets that demand? I think that that's something that districts particularly need to challenge themselves about. I've been in discussions now for the better part of a year with school districts talking about the alignment of their curriculum decisions as it relates to these interventions and how they're making sure that they are quality science of reading structured literacy programs. And I have heard districts that are doing wonderful things like, and I'm going to shout out to the ESC of Lorain County right now because they're actively working with school districts and have created this kind of decision-making rubric to really know how to do this. And so you have questions, that'd be a great resource for you. I have heard real quality work being done there. And then I recently was told that a district had selected their curriculum by going on Teachers Pay Teachers. Teachers Pay Teachers is not the greatest resource when it comes to making sure that your curriculum is aligned with this kind of intervention requirements. There really is no quality control in that resource. And I'm using that because I think people enjoy the kind of camaraderie that you can get from that website. I'm not suggesting you can't get good materials from it, but that should not be your decision-making framework for curriculum. And so again, I would really challenge schools, teachers, administrators to ask themselves truly, what is your selection criteria? How did you evaluate whether or not your curriculum meets these considerations? There's also in the first section of the guidebook some professional development requirements, and I'm going to go through those relatively quickly because I feel like this is an area that most school districts have really taken care of and run with. Within the teacher professional development requirements of the law, ODE in collaboration with the Dyslexia Committee has created a training program and also developed a list of training that fulfills the professional development requirements. All of the requirements and the trainings are aligned to the guidebook. They're aligned to the statutory provisions. They are required to be evidence-based and include instruction and training on identifying characteristics of dyslexia and understanding the underlying methods of structured literacy. So when I say structured literacy, I'm talking about a teaching method. I'm not talking about a particular program. There are several programs that have been created and designed to implement the methodology of structured literacy. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. The number of hours that are required is 18. So all teachers, except teachers whose sole assignments are fine arts, music, or PE, will be required to take this potentially at some point. And I say that because that is being rolled out over time. There's a slide here on what that content is required to include that is listed in the guidebook and in the law. And it includes the kinds of things that we had talked about: strategies for teaching word recognition, phonics, sight words, vocabulary, handwriting, language comprehension, the structure of language, fluency, the science of reading, defining dyslexia, looking at the characteristics of dyslexia, how an MTSS system of support and tiered systems of supports work. That content, there's a pre and a post assessment. And my guess is most teachers required to take this content by next year have probably already done so. The teachers who are required to have completed this training by next school year are all teachers in grades K through 1, including intervention specialists for those grades. We'll talk about why I'm a little concerned about that requirement in a minute, but this is what the law requires. The law requires that by the start of the next school year, in addition to those teachers, all teachers in grades 2 and 3, including intervention specialists, have to complete the training. And in another year beyond that, all intervention specialists serving grades 4 through 12 have to complete the 18 hours. Most districts are using the ODE approved Introduction to Dyslexia course. I think that's a great start. There are other approved courses. The one thing I would caution districts to do, if you are creating your own course, and it's my understanding that a couple of districts have done that, that you make sure that that course is approved, includes supervision by somebody who is certified. Why am I concerned about the training requirements? I'm concerned about the training requirements because the first year screening obligation goes well beyond students in grades K through 1. And I'm very concerned about having to roll out a screening requirement for students potentially up to grade 6. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I'm very concerned about rolling out a screening obligation, which will then have an intervention obligation for staff that have not yet received that basic training. So I think schools may be setting themselves up for a little bit of a disconnect between their requirements, the requirements for screeners and for intervention, if they're only doing training at that K-1 required level. Instead, I think you really should be looking at training your staff K through 6 at a minimum. I also think that it may be a mistake to only train your intervention specialists in grades 4 through 12. Because this is intended to be a general education initiative, and these are not students identified as in need of special ed at this point. These are all students. You're going to have a capacity issue in terms of having to service their needs if you are identifying students at those grade levels and then only having intervention specialists available to support. And I think when we're trying to envision how many students we may have to be looking at providing services for, we need to kind of take a look at, well, how many of our students are passing that 3rd grade reading guarantee? How many of our students, I mean, without accommodations, how many of our students are passing those Ohio State tests in reading? Where are the discrete elements? So have you taken your data and disaggregated it and really tried to see what is our basic decoding? What is our fluency measure? What can we reasonably expect? So I think you can see why I'm concerned about the considerations and some of the limitations that we have for this initial training component. Good news, most districts that I know of are training all of their teachers, at least K through 6, which I think is a great start. You know, getting those 18 hours in is, again, a good professional development start. I say a start, even though that's all that is required by the law, because in order to successfully implement other components of this legislation, you may need other training. And I outlined a few of those things here. So the professional development of the 18 hours is a wonderful foundational piece, but additional training is probably also going to be needed after you've identified your specific screener. So you will probably need training if you're a teacher in the administration and data analysis and collection of that screener. You may also need training on the Tier 1 intervention methods, the Tier 2 intervention methods, the diagnostic assessment that is planned at Tier 2. You may need additional training in the implementation of some of the methods, or frankly, in the district's decision-making tree. So how are we analyzing data? What are some of the points of decision-making that we need to push through? And in district, are we training on what our decision tree looks like? And so I'll get to that when we talk a little bit more about the intervention. But these, from a strategy perspective, are some considerations that I think our curriculum directors or special ed directors, you know, whoever's on this MTSS team really need to be honing in on and documenting for the benefit of our teaching staff. You know, someone had asked at one point, you know, what are the roles of the speech pathologist and the school psychologist in this decision? I think that's a great question. I'm hoping that as part of your MTSS teams that your districts are including those voices in some of this decision making. I also hope that they're being included in the training. And so I would encourage those related services providers and some of the individuals that I expect have some information about teaching of these particular skills or data collection and data analysis to be involved in some of this decision making and to be present on those teams. All right. I'm hoping we're doing well here. I'm going to keep going. It's a little difficult to know I'm talking to so many people, but not having an opportunity for feedback yet. So what I will say is, Sarah or Brett, if you guys are noticing anything that you think I need to be made aware of, please feel free to jump in. Section 2, and moving to Section 2, of the guidebook, that's really where we start talking about screening and screening of students for dyslexic tendencies. The screening requirements, as I had indicated to you for next year, are that we may be screening students K through 6. And what that means is that all students in grades K through 3 and any student in grade 4 through 6, if requested by a parent or requested by a teacher with parent consent, must be administered a Tier 1 screener. That goes down next year. And so the reason it goes down is that we assume that we're catching some of those kids grades 1 through 3. And next year, that requirement goes to any students in kindergarten and students in grades 1 through 6 if requested with consent. Transfer students are also included in this, transfer students K through 6. And at least for the first several years, those transfer students are counted because districts are going to have such different capacities initially that we're trying to capture students who may have come into a district that may not have had the screening either because they're out of state or may not have had intervention from another district. I want to make a quick note on what it means when I say kindergarten. So students in kindergarten, the timing of that assessment is open a little bit within this law. So the way that the legislature has defined kindergarten is any time between January of their kindergarten year and the following January. So they're looking at sort of this calendar year that is split between the end of a student's kindergarten year and the beginning of a student's first grade year. In discussions that I have had with guidebook committee members, professionals who are in this world, they really would like to see that screening happening in that spring semester of the kindergarten year. Looking at that time frame will allow them to capture students who are having difficulty with early identification of letters, letter sounds, difficulty with the phonemic awareness and the segmenting and the blending. And so they really are hoping that districts are using this process to catch kids at the second half of kindergarten. And so I just wanted to make that note. And what Tier 1 screener are you administering? Well, you're administering the one that your district chooses. And the districts are required to choose a screener off of the list that is approved by the Ohio Department of Education. And that list has been recently updated. I want to say it was updated either at the end of March or beginning of April. So that list is available on ODE's website. And if you go to their Dyslexia Law page, they'll link you through to the approved screeners for next year. The intention of the screener, once given properly, the students should be identified based on the results of the screener and the assessment of the student at risk. Now that at-risk determination is a cut score that is determined by the publisher of the instrument. So districts can't use their own cut scores. This is not something that is kind of manipulatable. It's the cut score for the assessment that is selected. And the purpose of that Tier 1 screener is to identify if the student is at risk, notify the parent that the student is at risk, and progress monitor that student at weeks 2, 4, and 6, following the administration of the screener. The reason that this is a Tier 1 screener and kind of this discussion that I want to have about, well, when do we start intervention? Intervention should be included in your quality Tier 1 program. And so what we should see, right, is that if your Tier 1 program is being implemented, it includes the structured literacy components. If that's being implemented with fidelity and our screener is picking up a student that is still at need or at risk, you have a couple of options as a district. You can start your intervention. You can increase or intensify what's happening, or you can progress monitor at weeks 2, 4, and 6. If you decide at that point that there is no progress observed during that monitoring period, then there should be a second notification to the family and the administration of a tier 2 screener. And so a tier 2 is more of a diagnostic assessment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One issue I think that we have is this determination of how much is enough progress during this sort of progress monitoring period. And I will get to that. The law itself doesn't answer that question, but there is information in the guidebook that I think we can use as a foundation for making those decisions. Obviously, the progress monitoring is going to have to occur at a rate that the student pulls out of being in that at-risk category. So we're not going to continue to kind of keep this student at this at-risk level without seeing them progress. So that's kind of one indicator that you're going to want to look for. A couple of strategy considerations that I want you to consider at this tier 1 level. Again, only a screener that's on the approved list. It has to be properly administered using publisher cut scores, must report results to parents, progress monitor, report the progress to the parents, and then go to a tier 2 diagnostic if no progress is observed. When we're talking about progress monitoring, we're talking about a standardized measure. We're not talking about looking at some kind of teacher-created progress monitoring process. It is to be a standardized measure. Some of your screeners can also be used for progress monitoring, and I anticipate that that's what most districts will do. The progress monitoring should align to all of those core areas of essential early literacy skills. So we want to make sure that we are assessing and monitoring the actual underlying skill that is showing a deficit. And I know that this kind of sounds like common sense, but sometimes we're not doing that. And so if we're talking about a deficit in phonemic awareness, I want our progress measuring and monitoring to focus on phonemic awareness. And you may have students with multiple areas within those core skills with deficits. So we need to be progress monitoring across the board on those areas that are showing a deficit. And then, of course, we have a big question mark. What is our decision point for referral to tier 2? Teachers need to know that. Parents are going to want to know that. Districts, what is your decision making? What does that look like? And a lot of that is going to be based on the tier 1 screener that you purchased and your progress monitoring strategy using that screener and the intervention that you have designed. And so, districts, you really need to kind of have these decision points in place so that when you start your screening process, there is something to do with all of that data. If we have students that are not showing progress using the tier 1 intervention after progress monitoring, you can refer them, or must refer them, to the diagnostic tier 2 assessment. Districts can choose to make that referral earlier. So if you do your tier 1 screener and decide that the results of that after the student's been involved in the tier 1 instruction are showing a deficit, a core deficit, you don't have to progress monitor for 6 weeks and wait. You can go right to administration of a tier 2 diagnostic assessment. And I think that's probably a good step to take, particularly for students who have been in rich tier 1 intervention that you have kind of already flagged, or the teacher has already kind of been working with a little bit extra. Waiting an additional 6 weeks is just waiting 6 weeks. And so I would encourage you for those kids to go right to that tier 2 diagnostic assessment. Now, this assessment is not necessarily a core screener that we have a list for. The purpose of the tier 2 diagnostic assessment is really to tell the district what the baseline foundational skills are that the students have in these core competency areas. so that once you begin the intervention, you can measure really where that instruction needs to go. So when we administer the diagnostic, we're doing two things. We're identifying if dyslexia tendencies or markers of dyslexia exist. And then we're using that to establish the foundation of our tier 2 intervention. And so, really this is a key piece. And the diagnostic assessment is intended really to align to the intervention that you have selected or that the district has selected for tier 2. So when we're talking about those diagnostics are typically norm referenced, criterion referenced, or curriculum based. And that is going to largely depend on either the program or the set of programs that the district has selected to form the foundation of their tier 2 intervention. And so we're looking to link that plan with the individual students' areas where they are showing as being at risk in those areas that we've assessed. So if a student has been assessed to have deficits in phonemic awareness, in decoding and in fluency, but not in reading comprehension or vocabulary, then we're really going to want to strengthen our tier 2 approach on those 3 areas of deficit. So where's our diagnostic? What is our plan for intervention? And how do we align the student need to that diagnostic? Again, once that diagnostic is completed, the results have to be reported to the parents. And if the student is identified as having markers of dyslexia, then a description of the district's structured literacy program has to be shared with them. So from that communication, there should be an understanding on the part of the parents as to where the student is assessed, where the deficits lie within those specific areas of reading, and then what the intervention is going to be to align to that area. All right, so now that we've gone through some of the professional development, some of the screening methods, and then now we need to kind of move toward methods for intervention. So the entire focus of this discussion has been on the incorporation of methods of instruction that are aligned to structured literacy. The reason for that is because Ohio law requires that districts select intervention measures from those identified in the guidebook. That is Ohio Revised Code, and the guidebook has identified structured literacy as the intervention required for this purpose. And so that's kind of where those laws align, and how we get from this is what the guidebook says, this is what the law says, to structured literacy is the intervention that is required. Section 3 of the guidebook is a wealth of information about structured literacy methods, how intervention is supposed to be aligned, what intervention should look like, strategies for determining intervention between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And what I really, really like about the guidebook is that there are tables and descriptions, and there is a roadmap there for teams to really work through this MTSS framework and make these decisions. What I've put a couple of pages on here, so when you're talking about kind of that tier 1 intervention, you're talking about intervention that is aligned to those 5 essential areas of reading that should achieve 80% of your students meeting expectations within that first level. If you as a district are consistently finding that your student identification numbers for the need for tier 2 intervention is exceeding 20%, then you probably have a tier 1 intervention problem or a tier 1 instructional problem where you need to analyze your curriculum and find the gaps. Really do an in-depth analysis as to where your curriculum is or is not meeting your students' needs, and then figure out how to supplement, replace, and make sure that you're meeting the bulk of your students' needs at that tier 1 level. When we're looking at trying to figure out our decision point between moving students from tier 1 to tier 2, again, the guidebook has a ton of information about that. What tier 2 intervention should look like and how it should differ from tier 1. There's a lot of great information in the guidebook about that as well. And really what we're talking about there is a shift towards strategic small groups. Again, small groups that are honing in on those essential areas. We are elevating the need to have explicit instruction, corrective feedback, sequential intervention, teaching from most simple to more complex. We're looking at a cumulative mastery of information as students move through. So those are the kinds of hallmarks that we're looking for when we get into tier 2. The guidebook will give you some information about how it's typically delivered, typically in a 30 to 45 minute block, 3 to 5 times a week. Typically, you want those groups to be somewhat homogeneous, meaning the students are addressing very similar needs or have very similar needs, and the teachers are addressing very similar concepts so that the targeted intervention, the explicit intervention can be there. Weekly progress monitoring is recommended by the guidebook so that intervention is conducted, results are graphed, and progress can be shared with parents. This is where in the guidebook, we really get some indication as to what kind of progress we're looking for when we're analyzing whether or not students are making progress in each of these tiers. And what the guidebook says is that this intervention is intended to catch up to grade level expectations and standards at an accelerated rate. So what we're looking for with this intervention is that we are closing the gap. And the reason we're looking to close the gap is because we don't want kids to languish in tier 1 and tier 2 for extended periods of time. If we are closing the gap, we should start to see students able to either move out of tier 2 back to tier 1, or we may see the identification of students who continue to need a tier 2 level of support in order to gain those skills, but they're making close the gap progress. If we are not seeing that kind of progress, then we need to talk about students that might need to be referred to tier 3. I put this as a separate slide because I really think it's important. When we are making decisions about how kids stay in these tiers, knowing when enough progress is being made, that our decisions are making sense for students. And if this is the standard that we're looking for, the close the gap kind of standard, and that's what is illustrated by the guidebook. And I think that's what the district decision-making structures need to include. And how you're progress monitoring that to be able to analyze this is important. A couple of additional strategy considerations, and I've talked about this already, but the intervention has to be aligned to the student areas of need. So as a district, what methods are you using to address each of those areas of need? Do you have one program or multiple programs? How are you combining interventions if a student has needs across multiple areas? How are you allocating time and resources? How are you grouping kids? What is your teacher capacity to deliver this instruction? Is it going to be push-in? Is it pull-out? Is it in gen ed? Is it in a separate location in a small group setting? What is the intensity? What is the frequency? What is the duration? And how are you setting up those groups for success? How are you setting up those teachers for success? Are they trained? Do they have these methods in their toolbox in order to use effectively and hopefully efficiently? I don't think anybody wants to see kids have to be in these interventions longer than necessary. But also, we know that if our tier 1 instruction isn't meeting the need for tier 2 instruction becomes more profound. And perhaps extended time in tier 2 instruction becomes more necessary because our tier 1 isn't meeting that need. So this is really where that analysis of your curriculum becomes so critically important, is to create an efficiency and an effectiveness in how we're working our later tiers, in trying to reduce the number of students that have to be in those higher tiers in order to get the instruction that they need. So a shift to tier 3. When do we make a shift to tier 3, and what does that mean? So districts are going to have to determine the criteria that they're going to use to decide when students need tier 3 intensive intervention. Typically, what we're going to find is that if following tier 2 intervention, students are not making close the gap progress, then a referral to tier 3 intervention would be made. And tier 3 intervention is individualized structured literacy instruction. And so again, the question is, what does that look like? In your district, does that mean that we're increasing the frequency or the length of the session and the instructional? Are we changing the program to be something a little more systematic, something that's broken apart those concepts even further? Are we looking at our group size? Are we moving from group to individual? Are we checking how often we're giving feedback, the immediacy of that feedback? Are we trying to establish errorless learning? What are the specific strategies that we're going to use to intensify that instruction at tier 3? Knowing that we're still obligated by this law to incorporate and use structured literacy practices. So this is where, again, in your decision tree, we really need to have some ideas to, how are we making these decisions? And especially in larger districts where you have these decisions that are going to need to be made in multiple buildings across multiple grade levels, having that decision structure in place is going to be critically important. Again, making sure that you've got your certified person on that team who can help make those decisions, who can help analyze data, who can help align programs to student needs. And so you kind of start to see the intersection of all of these requirements and how they fit together. So when we were talking about what does your curriculum actually do? What is your screener actually screening? How are you analyzing that data? Who do you have on your team who's certified that can help you with these decisions? So this is really how this all starts to intersect, weave together, and influence how you're structuring this whole process. And I really think that, unfortunately, it's then at this tier that most students access structured literacy for the first time. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I have seen some school districts doing some really good things, identifying particularly needs in phonemic awareness for their little ones, putting in place some quality early programs, some good tier 1 instruction, and we're seeing results. We're seeing results in those districts. Kids are not having to be referred for tier 3 or referred for special education in order to get the kinds of instruction that they need. So we're seeing this work, which is why there's been such a push to make it happen statewide. And I think why we're seeing the governor now talking about how important it is that we do these things in our schools. I want to make a little caveat here. I dwell in the world of special education 90% of the time, but I don't want to give the impression that tier 3 is synonymous with special education. It isn't. It can be, and students may need special education services in addition to tier 3 instructional services. So one thing that a school district is going to have to do, I think, very carefully, is decide when the team needs to move from tier 3 to a potential referral for special education. The guidebook addressed that specifically, and I think in a very nice way. So I do want to highlight for some of the decision folks here, really how to put that decision tree together. And it has to be done meaningfully, and it has to be done with some flexibility. And I say that because what the guidebook has suggested is that you look at your decision-making points as a district and highlight certain elements. Lack of anticipated progress within Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, a need for ongoing or lengthy involvement in Tier 3 interventions in order to gain new skills. And we see this with students, right? We see some students who just only learn these skills through this intensive intervention. The need for individualized or very intensive service, and the need for instruction that may not be able to be provided using just general education resources. And I would add to that, just from personal experience, that if you have a student who has multiple needs in different areas, including needs perhaps in speech and language, that also feed into the issues that they're demonstrating with reading and writing, that those are probably students that you're going to want to make a referral for to special education. Not to say that our speech therapists can't be used to supplement Tier 2 or Tier 3 instruction, because I would love to see that. But it's not a requirement of the guidebook, and often for students to access those services on an individual basis, they will need to be at least evaluated for special education services. I also don't want to make the mistake, though, of saying to districts, any kid in Tier 3 should be referred to special ed, because that's not necessarily the case. If you have quality Tier 3 intervention available to your students through the general education process, they're benefiting from it, they're closing the gap, then you may just be working the MTSS system the way it's supposed to work. And that is all good. That is exactly what we want to see, and what we are hoping that we will achieve. And frankly, what we're seeing some districts able to do. I know in looking at some numbers, referrals for special education in the area of specific learning disability and reading in districts that are implementing this kind of program with fidelity, we see dramatic decreases in the number of students that are referred. So kudos to the districts that are doing that well. And you know, I just pause and ask districts to pay attention to this piece of it as you're putting together your decision tree and trying to figure out strategically how you're going to manage the flow of students from Tier 1 to 2 to 3 to potentially special education, and making sure that you're providing some foundation for your teams to have to kind of make this decision. Because I do often challenge districts when there is a child find problem, when a child has languished in intervention for too long without progress, and we haven't done more. And so, again, it's a nuanced decision, but one that I think your teams are probably going to need some guidance in making. All right. A couple of additional considerations and things where I think the law is a good start, but where we might have some holes. And I want to talk about older students. Students in grades 4 and on who may not have had the benefit of this system, who are still showing significant problems with reading, decoding, basic reading skills, reading fluency. What do you do for those students? You have to answer that question as a district. Not thinking about those kids while you're doing this is a disservice to those students. And so as you're putting together your decision processes for those K-3 kids, really think about, how do we apply our structured literacy intervention to these older kids? How do we put together a framework to address those needs? I guarantee you parents are going to be asking, right? Parents can ask the kids up to 6th grade to be screened. They're going to be asking, what are you going to do with those kids that are identified? You're not, you have to go through the intervention process for those kids. So make sure you're building your capacity at those grade levels. And I would encourage you, for students at the middle school and high school level, really take a look at those kids who are not succeeding. Figure out how you're gonna provide structured literacy for those kids that are older. How are you going to incorporate that explicit direct instruction, particularly in basic reading skills, since those are no longer taught at those grade levels, particularly in phonemic awareness, particularly in those essential core elements of reading that these kids may have missed out on. And then also take a look at how this may apply to other students with disabilities. There is no exception in the screening requirements for students who have learning needs beyond reading deficits. And so, you know, right now, at least, this screener is going to have to be provided to students of all ability levels. We do believe that structured literacy approaches have been found to be evidence-based interventions for some students, with a variety of co-occurring difficulties. And I think understanding how you may need to adapt your instruction or your intervention procedures to address the needs of some of those students is something that we're probably going to have to start addressing. I don't think ODE has answered that question yet. So take a look at some of those considerations as you try to figure out how you're going to manage that. All right, and then the last section, that I want to talk about before we get to some Q&A is certification in structured literacy. The law requires that districts establish a structured literacy certification plan for teachers providing instruction to students in grades K through 3. I would encourage you again to try to make some provisions for those students in grades 4 through 6 and 6 through 12 who haven't benefited from this before. But the law requires K through 3. And each school district has the ability to determine locally how that certification process will play out within their district, and which of the pathways that are identified in the guidebook will be used. So there are a variety of different pathways that can be used. Procedures are going to be unique to each district and probably aligned to the methodology and in some ways the curriculums that they've decided to embrace as part of this process. So the guidebook recommends that you identify and recruit certified educators. And I know all of the districts who have certified their people are like clawing to hold on to them. So districts, I encourage you to consider how you're going to retain your certified educators. I know that this is an issue that a lot of districts are grappling with. Also, identify your certification candidates. Who is interested in becoming certified? What training and experience do they have? Take a look at what you expect your needs to be in terms of how many staff members you look to certify. And then, of course, look to external trainers. Again, there are a multitude of different training options, all very clearly outlined in the guidebook. And so trying to consider what your district's pathway might look like. You may want to consult with people who are familiar with those different pathways. Looking at those pathways, again, they must be approved through the law and through the guidebook. So I do have some handouts that I can give you that will talk about the certification pathways. Again, they're located within the guidebook. Each pathway, and I want to be very specific about this. Each pathway includes a training component, a supervised practicum, which requires the person getting training to implement this method over time with feedback and correction, and then an assessment or exam component to certify that through that instruction and practicum process, the person has built competency to provide this instruction with fidelity. And then the purpose and the role of that certified structured literacy interventionist is multifaceted. It is to provide intervention to students, and then it is also to, as we've talked about before, assist the MTSS team in making the multitude of decisions that districts need to make in order to make this process work efficiently, effectively, and for the benefit of the students and the teachers that are implementing it. So the role of the certified person is really critically important. And I would encourage every district at every level to figure out how you roll this out and how you build your capacity quickly to get individuals properly certified. All right. Some additional resources that might be helpful. And again, I'm happy to provide copies of these resources. I have them all in PDF to the organizations that have hosted this event, but they include some attachments. The guidebook, we've already talked about it. There are several Ohio Revised Code sections. So if you're looking for specific information about what teacher development needs to include, what dyslexia screening needs to include, you want to look at what the actual law says. These Ohio Revised Code citations are here for you to go in and actually take a look at what the law says. Within the guidebook, there is additional guidance on each of these things, and it's a much easier read than the actual statutory language. But if you're just a person who really wants to go to the source, that's your source. There are some other Ohio Department of Education documents that I would encourage you to look at. ODE has published a lot of information on teacher professional development, on their screener lists, guidance on the certification process. And so there's just a lot of information there. The guidebook committee also has supplemental information that they have provided regarding certification and certification methods. So I would encourage you to really take a look at that. You know, with the IDA, both Central Ohio and Northern Ohio branches, we're very committed to the knowledge and practice standards through the International Dyslexia Association and the SERI certifying organization. But there are numerous private companies that also provide certification that I would encourage you to take a look at. Those are listed in the guidebook, and they are also referenced from the guidebook to other organizations. A few other supplemental materials that the school districts might particularly want to take a look at. The Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center at Ohio State University has created a set of materials that will give sample school year timelines for screenings, sample letters for notifying parents, sample communications about their decision-making tree. There's a good dyslexia resource guide there for Ohio families, and then for parents, there is a sample letter that you can use to request a screening if your child is in grades 4 through 6 next year, and then a sample letter for schools to send after that screening has occurred. And before we shift to questions, what I would like to do briefly is just to kind of let everyone know about a few things that our sponsoring organizations have coming up. And the first thing that I want to tell everyone about is we are so excited that the International Dyslexia Association annual conference, our national conference, is coming to Columbus this fall, October 12th through the 14th at the Hyatt Regency in Columbus. I know IDA of Central Ohio is really looking to push this for the schools and the parents in their areas. We have a lot of people in Northern Ohio that are planning to come down for this as well. It is not often that we get a program of this caliber in our own backyard. And so I would encourage anyone who has a deeper interest in learning more about the interventions and about dyslexia to come to this conference. It is going to be focused on dyslexia, but also on the science of reading as a whole. And IDA National has an initiative to really support states that are doing this. And so we're very excited that they are coming to Ohio for the first time. Also, through IDA Central Ohio, you can register through this slide. I have an active link to register for DyslexiaCon 2023. That's the IDA National Conference. We also have their helpline and contact information, and you can follow them on Facebook and Twitter for news and updated events. We're going to do Ohio Kid next. So Ohio Kid is the state of Ohio arm of the national organization Parents for Reading Justice. Parents for Reading Justice and Ohio Kid were both founded by our own Brett Tingley, who is a powerhouse for pulling parents and families together who have been engaged in the fight for structured literacy. And I just thank you, Brett, for the work that you're doing, Parents for Reading Justice. And for more information about what they do, feel free to scan that QR code or visit their website at parentsforreadingjustice.org. And I'll make one other plug because I don't think Brett will, but they're in the middle of a fundraising effort right now for a podcast, a regular podcast. So if you are so inclined and would like to learn more or donate to the effort, please do so. And then finally, my home branch, IDA of Northern Ohio, what I would like to ask you to do is to mark your calendars for some of our summer professional development opportunities. We are offering this summer a Wilson Language System 3-day overview, a Wilson Just Words training, Wilson Foundations, and also some online multisensory math instruction with Marilyn Zucker. That's a two-day, half-day training online. The Wilson PD programs will be in person in Summit County, so in the Akron, Ohio area. We also have a 35th anniversary Founders Dinner celebration coming up September 28th, and that is also going to launch our 35th annual symposium, which will be an online, all virtual program about the state of Ohio and reading in Ohio. So we are hoping that you will join us for those. Also, we hope to see you all at IDA National Conference in Columbus. And I have attached the contact information for the Northern Ohio branch as well. So a special thank you to IDA of Central Ohio for putting together the registration for this. Diane McGovern, Christy Wackler, you guys are amazing. We all thank you so much on behalf of all three organizations and myself personally. I'd like to extend a thank you to you as well. Okay, I think that may have taken us to questions. And I am going to stop sharing so that I can see people. I hope that that all came across well. It's hard without feedback to make sure. So, Sarah, Brett, I welcome questions.
Okay, well, we have a lot of questions, Kerry. That was fantastic. So interesting. So I'll go ahead and start. I've tried to kind of group the questions together to some degree. So we do have a set of questions that really just are from people who are curious about how this applies to private and charter schools, just in general, the law in general.
Well, the law in general, there's not a lot of application to private or charter schools. Excuse me. I thought I'd make it through, but just a couple, just a few minutes ago, I give me a second.
Oh my gosh, I hope you're feeling okay, Kerry. Thank you for sticking with this.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. So, looking specifically at the requirements are for school districts. The requirements are not for private schools. And so private schools don't have the same demand for either screening or for the provision of structured literacy. And so simply it's a public school district demand.
Okay, thank you so much. Then we have a set of questions that are really focused on what if you have already been identified as having dyslexia? And then there's a second one, what if you have a specific learning disability in reading, writing, and spelling? So how does this process, this MTSS process apply to those students?
So the MTSS process is a general education initiative, and it's going to apply across the board to all students. And so I think it's a great question, right? Some of these things we just really don't know yet. We haven't seen how it's going to work. But what I would encourage schools to do, again, students, even if they're on an IEP, are still subject to the screening requirement. If you're identifying through that screener things that your evaluations or students who are already identified are not receiving services, you're going to need to provide those services just as you would to any other general education student that was identified. I would encourage you that if you have a student with an SLD in reading, or you have a student who is already receiving interventions, that you align the interventions and look at tier 3 interventions depending on the depth of the need. So again, an IEP team is going to make an individualized decision for every student, but I would encourage IEP teams to take a look at aligning that instruction with the structured literacy and with the requirements of this law. I'm hoping a lot of schools are doing that already. I'm not naive enough to think that all of them are. But truly the evidence-based intervention that IDEA calls for, I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these students should be getting this intervention already.
That is very helpful. Thank you so much. So this next set of questions really just focuses on the timeline for screening for kindergarten students. There's a specific question. One is just asking for a recap or clarification about that. And the other is asking if it's possible to screen earlier than January of the kindergarten year.
It is difficult to screen students earlier than January of kindergarten year. It's not impossible. A lot of it depends, though, on whether or not the student has had access to instruction. And so students enter kindergarten with a wide variety of having had access to any instruction. So some students come into kindergarten never having been in school before, never having been exposed to the alphabet or alphabetic principles. And so screening that student without the opportunity for any kind of instruction would really not be a great timing. However, if you have a student or a child who's been age 3, age 4, they've done multiple pre-kindergarten kinds of literacy, and we know that even with that intervention, there is a great deal of concern about a student's access to literacy, then we want to make sure that then we want to make sure that students are getting that. Oh, excuse me.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. This next one, oh, am I interrupting you, Kerry? I'm sorry. Were you finished?
No.
Okay.
No.
This next one is about vision. Is vision related to dyslexia, and why don't the screeners assess vision?
Vision. So vision is not associated with dyslexia. There are separate vision issues that might make a child look like they're having trouble. So there are some vision issues that are convergence insufficiencies with the way the eyes work, but that is not a component of dyslexia. So a student who has a vision issue may also struggle to read the letters on the page, but that is not a component of an assessment for dyslexia.
Thank you for clarifying. So
I want to go back and clarify one thing. You had asked me earlier about charter schools.
Right.
And the term charter schools is used differently in Ohio than it is in other states. So I want to clarify that there are public community charter schools that are subject to this law, but private chartered non-public schools are not. So I just want to make that clarification in case there was some confusion.
Thank you for clarifying. So this next question focuses on the multidisciplinary team, specifically. I think it's when you were talking about the stakeholder with expertise in the identification, intervention, and remediation of dyslexia. And the question is there one person per district? Are there any recommendations or guidelines about that?
So again, it's your MTSS planning team that has to include that stakeholder. Different districts are going to sort of create those teams at different levels, but it's going to be your top tier decision-making team that's going to have to include that. As that is sort of, again, this is up to your district decision tree, but as that kind of goes down into different buildings or at different administrative levels, you may want to decide how that voice is represented on that team.
Okay. This is the question. I'll read it as is. Is a 5-day OG training sufficient for a general education elementary certified teacher to be considered for the certified? I think that means the stakeholder on the multidisciplinary team.
No, when you're talking about a person who is certified on the MTSS team, that person is certified based on the Ohio guidebook definition of certified. So that is a person who has had the training, taken a practicum, and become certified through one of the approved pathways.
Okay. We did have a person asking where to find the information about the expectations or requirements around certification, and should we direct them back to the guidebook? That's the best source or good source of information.
Yeah, the guidebook
Okay.
or the code section. And so I can go back in here and take a look at that. Yeah. So in terms of the teacher professional development, that's going to be Ohio Revised Code 3319.077. Structured literacy certification is going to be 3319.078. And those are going to be the two sort of sources of information about what the law requires. And then again, in the guidebook, you're going to see exactly what certification means and how it's been defined.
Okay. There is a question about the tiers of support. And a student who's accessing tier 3, does that mean they're not accessing support in tier 1 or tier 2 while they're accessing tier 3?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So it depends. Most students who are accessing support in tier 3 will need some carve out of time to do that. Usually the recommendation is that that's happening while other students are in tier 1, getting that same piece of it, unless that student is getting a carve out in tier 3 for a very particular reason. Then you don't want them missing the tier 1 instruction that's for all of the other reading components. So it really is largely dependent on how the districts are designing each of their processes, because again, you don't want to carve out and send the student to tier 3 for intervention, well-meaning in phonemic awareness and in decoding, but then have them miss all the comprehension having a tier 1. So you really need to be very specific about how you're managing the scheduling, how you're managing the rollouts, and how all of that pieces together. It's a very complex process that is required. This is not business as usual. This is really a complex thing that requires a lot of advanced planning and consideration at high administration levels and at building levels to figure out how to implement properly.
Well, speaking of complexity, go ahead.
I want to say one more thing.
Okay.
And what I want to say is, if your tier 3 is conflicting with some of your tier 1 intervention, and I'm just going to be really blunt here, if your tier 1 intervention is still relying on 3 queuing system balanced literacy approaches, and you're building something else through tier 2 and tier 3, you could be undoing the intervention you're doing in tier 3 with other things in tier 1. And at that point, you really need to analyze what that student is doing, because you don't want to confuse or or create difficulty for that student in implementing the tier 3 interventions that you're providing. So being very cognizant of what you're communicating and in which tier and how that's all working together is really important. So I just wanted to mention that as we were on the topic.
Thank you so much. This next question, I think, is a tricky one. How do you determine what close the gap progress is? And by the way, as you were making those comments, my phone was blowing up a little bit. It just really resonated with people, Kerry. It's so important, and we loved how you phrased that. But this is the question: how do you determine what close the gap progress is?
I thank the guidebook for the phrasing.
Okay.
You know, truly what you're looking at is when you have a standardized norm referenced assessment or curriculum-based assessment, you are trying to figure out how that student is progressing along with their peers. So there has to be an element at some point throughout this process where you're looking at not just where this student is in the progression of their own skills, but also how that aligns to the progression of the typical student. And if what you're seeing is that the typical student has progressed from here to here, and this student has only progressed to here, and then the next time your student has progressed to here, and the other typical kids have gone to here, then you're closing that gap between what your student is capable of doing and what the rest of the students are capable of doing. Conversely, if you are finding that the assessments that your student is taking takes them here, and gen ed is here, and the next time you run those assessments, your student gets to here, but gen ed gets to here, that gap is widening, which means that that intervention, the student may be making progress against himself, but will never catch up. And the gap between where they are and where all of their peers are is going to continue to widen. So we're looking for close the gap progress. I want to be cautious though. I want to say, like, we also talked about kids that may have multiple impairments or multiple disabilities or multiple areas of concern where an analysis of what is meaningful progress for that student might be different. And what I would submit to the people in this discussion is that, you know, at that point, you really have to look at the developmental trajectory of the student, but also their progress within this method, right? Because if they're never given the method, you can't predict necessarily how they're going to progress in it. And so you have to look both at how are they progressing with the method and how are their peers progressing, and then start to compare those two to see, can I adjust the intensity and pull out some more intensity to really close that gap, or is there an inherent issue with the way the student is learning the information such that progress is going to be different for that student? But that's an analysis that is probably better left to a special education kind of analysis.
Thank you so much. Well, we only have a few minutes left, I believe. And I would say we weren't able to address all of the questions, but the set of questions that we were not able to address mainly focused on really technical questions about certification, you know, those types of requirements. And so I think you already addressed where to go if you have a question, what is a good resource. And so I think we can leave our participants with that. But Brett, is there anything that you wanted to share to help us wrap up?
I just wanted to thank both of you. This was very, very informative. Really, I've heard this 2 times already, and I learned something new every time. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. And thank you to the IDA, Central Ohio, Northern Ohio, and Parents for Reading Justice in Ohio Kid. This is a great group of people who really are committed, and the number of people that we had attend today just really tells me how committed everyone else in this state is to making this work. So thank you, and thanks to guidebook committee members, the Ohio Department of Education, and everybody working really hard to make this happen.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much.